All right. You ready to do this?
Yeah, man, let's do it.
All right. All right. Here we go. So, all right. So 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, guys, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. I am super excited to have joining me in this series on managing in the midst of COVID-19, Dr. Mica Gonzalez. Mica, welcome.
Hey, Guy. Thanks for having me back. It's good to be here.
All right. So Dr. Gonzalez is the co-founder and clinical director of Family First Psychotherapy in Oakland, California. He specializes in helping anxious, aggressive, and hyper kids and their stressed out parents. Mica received his doctoral degree from the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology and trained in a variety of settings, including a middle school, an adult date treatment facility, and home visiting early intervention programs. He's trained in child-parent psychotherapy, a trauma-informed approach to early intervention, and has an endorsement as an early childhood mental health specialist from the California Center for Infant, Family, and Early Childhood Mental Health. He also provides online early parenting education through his blog and website, The Good Enough Parents. All right, sir. As I was saying, kind of before we started here, this series came together very quickly for me, and I put the word out to my community who, they wanted to hear from. And like I said to you, your name came up. So I'm really fortunate that, you were like, all right, let's do it. First off, how are you? I didn't even ask you that. How are you doing?
Well, I feel like I'm doing pretty good now. There was a little adjustment for me. I think I'm prone to minimizing the impact of stressors. And so sometimes there's a little lag, and I'll notice it and sort of being a little irritable, which my wife can vouch for. And then that's when it starts to settle in. I realize, okay, this is, it's having an impact on me too. I'm not impervious to the stress that's kind of pervading our world right now. But, and I heard this also from families that, that I'm working with, that for some of us, there's this kind of trajectory of like natural heightened anxiety and stress. And then as we start to settle into a routine and start to, at least for me, the dust has settled to the extent that it can. And of course, I try and practice what I preach. So self-care is huge for me.
Right. I was, I think I alluded to before we started recording, when everything started, I was overwhelmed with trying to, just the information, the headlines.
Yeah.
And I'm someone who likes to keep up with the news, but it just, and then with the kids were home, my wife is working. So now I'm home with 2 kids trying to work from home. Nuts. Yeah. I was like so crazy anxious, and I was like, dude, you've got to dial it in. And seriously, and I did, and I have been, and this has helped. And like talking to you, people like yourself really helps. So well, let's start here. What, from your experience, with your experience, and from your perspective, what's your take on how what's going on is impacting us as a species collectively? And I know that's a big question, but I just want to hear some of your thoughts, and then we'll kind of dial in a bit.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big question, but I think the answer in some ways is probably fairly obvious, because I mean, I think a lot of folks are shitting their pants, man. I mean, metaphorically speaking, hopefully. This is something that most of us haven't faced before. You could say it's something that kind of none of us faced, except for maybe, communities in Western Africa with the Ebola outbreak some years ago and SARS. But I read an article the other day by a political science professor who apparently had grown up in war-torn countries, or had been through something like this, where there's a kind of lockdown situation, and that kind of made me realize that, oh yeah, there are plenty of other situations that are similar, at least there are plenty of other communities and countries that have had to go on these kind of lockdowns and had to kind of shelter in place because of immediate dangers, just obviously
Right.
places like Syria or any place that's suffering a war. So, I mean, I think there's, on the one hand, I'm sure there's a lot of anxiety. But what I've been focusing a little bit more on lately is just kind of, examples of resilience. And one of the things that I started looking at, and it's actually been a few days now, is this website called, it's Upworthy, I think. Upworthy, yeah, Upworthy.com. And they seem to focus, I mean, I've only looked at it a few times, and I saw it a couple of years ago because it had a few trending stories on Facebook or something like that. They have a collection of just positive things.
Oh, love it.
Are trying to help. I think one of the first stories, can't remember if it was on Upworthy or another news outlet, but Kevin Love, who plays for the Cleveland Cavaliers,
Mm-hmm.
early things he did as soon as NBA season got canceled was give money to was somehow fund some of the workers in the arena. I don't think it was like something like 100,000 or something.
Right.
It was just, he was like, immediate, let's take action and help people who are suffering. This is sort of the work that you and I and all the listeners, or most of the listeners, do. So I'm thinking about, and this, I'm sure this is a personal thing for me, the need to see these kinds of
Mm-hmm.
examples of resilience and examples of altruism and examples of people being together and helping each other out.
Right.
But I was on a walk the other day, with my family and talking with my wife about how cool it may be. We may look back in the next months or years, the effort, the global effort to try and deal with this. And, the first thing that came to mind to me was the global effort to find an effective vaccine.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm imagining, I have no evidence as of yet, but I'm imagining there are many teams of, brilliant, seasoned researchers, practitioners who are hard at work on this.
Right.
I'm looking forward to hearing those stories about, what kind of coordination was happening across
Right. Yeah.
across departments, because I think we're gonna get some of those, because we haven't all been in it together in this way, at least in my lifetime. I could imagine maybe half of the world feeling that, and like,
Mm-hmm.
or something like that. But we are kind of, for better or worse, all in it together. So I find myself going towards those, the positive things, in spite of, my training to really stay with the tough stuff, to meet the suffering head on.
Well, I know from my experience, when I do read those stories that are positive, I can feel it in my body automatically. And it's so easy for me at least, to be pulled into those headlines that are just so daunting, that are just so, they can be really frightening and depressing. And quite frankly, I don't have control over that,
Right.
and so anyway, I really appreciate you mentioning that. I'm going to include that Upworthy site in the show notes here, but that's I think a really good reminder for us. And I don't think we can have enough of those reminders, the importance of that, seriously. So are you still working now, and in what capacity are you working?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. That's been interesting too. That's kind of another, again, sort of reframing the situation. This has been a good learning opportunity for me professionally, because I work with a lot of kids. I work with adults and couples and stuff too, but I work with a number of kids right now as young as 4, and
wow,
doing all video conference or phone also with some adults. And that's a trip. That is I didn't know it was possible, but it's not the same, of course, but I am having good experiences with kids and I have a 6-year-old who was able to have a session with me in his room with the computer without, and this is a patient that I typically see just me and him. And even though parents are involved with the parent consultation sessions, he was able to have a whole session with me in his room without his parents.
Oh.
It's just really cool to see that, I think the kids in some ways are more adaptable than we are. This is like a cool thing. I get to see a person I like, through the screen.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like, things have been going good. I had done like telehealth before, even since my pre-doctoral internship in 2010. So I had some experience with it. And so it's not that new, but the experience of coming into my office and then just being, sitting in my seat the whole time,
Mm-hmm.
that feels weird. In the first couple of days, I was kind of exhausted, even though I wasn't moving around nearly as much as I do with the kids in the session. So I don't know. I think it's cool. I'm definitely still learning. I'm going to have a Zoom call with some colleagues, some other child therapists, just to be like, hey, how's this going?
Right.
Gleaning things. I also just came across the document, and this might be good actually for any of your listeners who are working with kids too. And I haven't read through the document, but it looks promising. And I can't remember the name of the institute, but there's an institute of, some sort of telehealth institute who's put out a report or put out some guidelines for doing health with children and youth. So I'm planning on going through that again and, keeping up with this big experiment.
How, in terms of COVID-19, with that kind of serving as somewhat of a context, how is that, or is it coming into play with these young kids? Maybe not 4 or 6, but
yes.
Maybe so.
Yeah. Yes. Well, definitely. I mean, honestly, the kind of general rule is that the younger the kid, the more likely something like this is going to impact them for a number of reasons, sort of being more sensitive to the variations in the parents' emotional states and changes in routine, and then being less equipped to sort of use the cognitive and intellectual faculties to make sense of that appropriately. Unfortunately, being more magical.
Let me focus on that, because I think that might strike some people as kind of interesting, maybe.
Yeah.
So the younger the kid is, the more they're going to be impacted, kind of. Yeah. Okay.
As a rule, sure.
As a rule.
And in part because they'll they have less, their minds are less mature, and they also have less life experience to draw upon. So, for example, if a 7-year-old sees, it goes out for a walk in their neighborhood and they see a neighbor wearing a mask versus a 2-year-old, a 7-year-old may have more experience going to the doctors, have real concrete memories of doing that and seeing people with masks on. Maybe they've already asked the question, well, why are they wearing a mask? Is that a costume? Are they scared of it? Because they can't see the person's face. That's more likely to be confusing or potentially overwhelming or frightening for a 2-year-old, because they don't understand the context. And I think a big differentiator too, what I've been thinking about recently, is just, does a child understand germs, the concept of germs? And I find it so much easier to explain to a child, if this is an inquisitive child who's able to sort of take in as much information as would be helpful to give them, then I'm finding that if they can get this idea of germs, good germs and bad germs, it goes a long way in helping them understand some of these changes. Things like masks, things like washing hands, things like keeping distance.
All right, guys, I want to welcome back Talkspace as a sponsor to the podcast. You know, we all have something we want to change about ourselves, whether it's spending too much time on social media or wanting to start a new hobby. But if you're like me, like most people, taking action can feel almost impossible without the right support. Talkspace Online Therapy is the most convenient and affordable way to make lasting change in your life with the support of a licensed therapist. Send your licensed therapist text, audio, picture, or video messages from your phone or computer whenever you need to, even if it's on the way to work. You don't have to make appointments or deal with extra commutes. Everything happens within Talkspace's secure platform, all on your schedule. Talkspace matches you with a licensed therapist based on your needs and preferences. They have thousands of licensed therapists trained in over 40 specialties. So if you have something very specific you want to work on, they will find someone right for you. Once you're matched, you can begin therapy that very same day. The bottom line is that life can be hard, and Talkspace wants to make sure more of us get the support we need at a price we can afford. As a listener of this podcast, you can get $100 off your first month on Talkspace. To match with your perfect therapist, go to Talkspace.com or download the app. Make sure to use the code TRAUMATherapist to get $100 off your first month and show your support for this podcast. Once again, go to Talkspace.com and use the code TRAUMATherapist.
But yes, returning to the original question, to definitely think about that. One of the big challenges with the real little ones too is that they're not going to say, hey, you know, things are changing and it's making me anxious. You know, how can you help me with this? They're just not going to do that. They're just going to throw more tantrums. They're going to have trouble sleeping. They're going to have trouble eating. They're going to show these things through their behaviors. They're going to show the stress through their behaviors.
Okay. So what's the, how would a parent respond to that in a sense, or a therapist? What should they be aware of, knowledgeable about?
I think it's kind of like just going back to basics, in the sense of it, you know, the centerpiece is safety and security. So taking the changes in the child, so if a child is having some of these, you know, increased emotionality, or even increased aggression or something like that, low frustration tolerance, these are things that you often see when a child is feeling a lot of stress. You know, going back to just the basics of acknowledging the changes, acknowledging feelings, validating those feelings, and then also providing that reassurance. And you know, when I'm working with families, I do help them, you know, collaborate with them, coach them on getting the language right for like developmentally appropriate reassurance and communication, all that sort of stuff. But I really try and emphasize the action more than the words, because that's, you know, action. We say that play is the language of childhood, and you know, those are all actions. So doing things like hugging and having family time, you know, singing, and I'm talking about little ones in particular, but, you know, parents may be finding that even some of their older kids are, 7, 8, 9, those are not very old, but they're out of that early childhood range, may be regressing somewhat in response to the stress, but continuing to, you know, one of the recommendations that I've been giving, that I've seen written a lot too, is just maintaining a routine. You know, it's kind of like, right now, it's kind of like we're on vacation, but we're just not having any of the fun. And so because there's a quasi vacation consciousness,
right,
it's easy to get out of the normal routines. So what I'm trying to help people focus on is just kind of the bare minimum of maintaining a routine, like sleeping routines, whether that's bedtime or nap time, and also eating mealtime routines, and having those be kind of the anchors for the day. Because, you know, many parents, you know, those who are fortunate enough to, you know, still have their jobs, their work is out of whack too, right? And it's more flexible. So you have to kind of you have to artificially, whereas it's been done for us, school starts at a certain time, it ends at a certain time.
Right.
We have to kind of manufacture this routine and structure. And I'm not suggesting that it has to be like over the top, but just starting and maybe even ending with the bedtime and the mealtime as a way of anchoring the day and providing that kind of rhythm and predictability for the little one.
Right. Okay. Now, in terms of a little older, say like 10, 11, 12, 13, obviously those kids have the language to a certain degree to, express more. What are your thoughts about working with those that age group in a sense?
Well, I think, the importance of self-care, it's not only for adults, it's for the kids too. We're lucky in a way because most of our kids have, even the kids that we see in the clinic, not only our personal children, they have built-in coping mechanisms. And one of the best ways to cope for a little kid, a 2-year-old or a 9-year-old is to play.
Mm-hmm.
We really want to be having a lot of playtime, as much as possible. And, this is, to your point earlier, like, you're home now with your kids, right? And so you're wearing more hats than you usually do. So your time may actually be diminished compared to previously when you had other adults taking care of and educating your kids. So playtime, I think, is huge. If you can do it, family playtime is great too. I really like that, 9, 10, 11 range because their cognitive faculties are so well developed at that point, have those kinds of conversations. But thinking about their self-care, I use the acronym REFS, stands for relationships, exercise, food, and sleep. So what I'm encouraging families to do is to help their 10-year-olds stay connected to friends. And, I think there's been just kind of organically, there's been an explosion of Zoom play dates.
Yeah.
What I'm hearing and seeing and, trying to do with my own kids too. And again, it's, it's a different format, but the kids can do it. I was talking to one of my buddies from high school. His son is 4 and his nephew is like 3.5 or something. And they set the two of them down in front of their computers, their respective computers, and just let them go for they just went back and forth for an hour and a half.
Mm-hmm.
It's doable.
Right.
And I don't encourage parents to try and go into super parent mode unless that works for them.
What do you mean by super parent mode?
Super parent, I'm going to be a homeschool teacher now. I'm going to do Instagram and Facebook worthy activities and projects. You learn new skills and come out of this, CEO of your own Fortune 500 company at age 12. Those kinds of things. I think it's especially because as far as we can tell, we're at the beginning. And that same article I read by the political science professor is talking about thinking about this thing as a marathon.
Mm-hmm.
So don't try and sprint because you'll burn out. And I think there's probably some people who will do well to keep trying to be the super parent. But I think it's probably a tiny percentage of people. I think most people would most benefit from just going into a kind of deep acceptance of what is. And not just in one moment. I mean, having a practice of acceptance of where they're at, what they're doing, and then also focusing, especially right now, on that self-care for all family members. So, talking about the 10-year-old who needs to stay connected with their friends, super important for parents to stay connected with their friends. Last 2 Saturdays, I've had a group Zoom with, just some buddies of mine, drinking some beer and,
Mm-hmm.
watching little videos and just having a good time and laughing together. I think that for me, that goes a long way to being a social person.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are great suggestions. In terms of some ideas for therapists, a lot of people who are listening to this are newer therapists, are newer trauma therapists. Let's bring in the idea or the concept, if you will, of trauma, and continuing to talk about that age group of 10, 11, 12. How might a therapist introduce that topic, that possibility into a discussion? Is that something you would suggest a therapist would bring up or just allow to unfold? What are your thoughts on that?
That's a good question, man. I don't feel like I have a solid answer for that yet. Of course, I do have kids in my practice with trauma histories, and I feel like that's kind of a growing edge in terms of how much can I do through this medium around the issue of trauma. So I feel like, in short, I'm still learning. So I don't know, but I can tell you some of the things that I'm thinking about. It's not my nature to, if it comes up in the session, it's not my nature to close it down, either explicitly or implicitly. In some ways, because I think this isn't 100% of the time, but more often than not, in my experience, when a child brings it up, they have a certain amount of readiness to,
Mm-hmm.
even if it's brief, even if it's testing the waters. So, now having had 2 weeks of video conference, some of the things I'm thinking about is, what is the immediate emotional container for the bringing forth of the trauma? And I'm specifically thinking about, who's in the house? Are they available? Am I talking with them? So this is one of the things I do a lot when I work with kids is, I'm on the phone or having, in-person meetings. I'm not now, but in general, I'm having a lot of parenting consultation sessions because the parents can do so much to extend the work and add to and collaborate. So if we're gonna be doing some trauma work, I want the parents to know beforehand.
Mm-hmm.
And I just got off the phone with a grandmother, and just talking with her. In CPP, or child parent psychotherapy, they call it unstructured developmental guidance. And so I'm just talking with her about how the patient might go through the next few weeks and months, because he had a week or two after the shelter in place. He had a week or two of like just kind of just feeling like relief of not having to go to school and things like getting to play, with his cousins because they live in the same home. But now and this is a kid with a pretty acute trauma history. And so now some of the trauma that he experienced is actually in the home that he lives in now, which is totally safe. But those trauma reminders, those trauma triggers are starting to creep back in.
Right.
I was giving her some guidance on how this might play out in the coming weeks, and what are some of the needs that he might have, so that sense of an emotional container is a little closer and a little more full. In preparation for the possibility of some more acute or more direct trauma work. Awesome.
All right. So what's next for you? What do you have going on right now or coming up?
Well, right now, my co-founder and I at Family First Psychotherapy in Oakland, Dr. Sam Himmelstein, who you know well, we are, part of this early phase of the pandemic for us has been really discerning how we can help, because we're, I said in the little explainer video for a webinar we're about to do, we've never been through this before, right? but in a way, we've really been trained for this. You know,
Mm-hmm.
I think that's true for most, if not all, of your listeners. This is kind of what we do. These are the psychological states that we work with.
Mm-hmm.
And although we're probably most of us going to be doing it by phone and by telehealth or by video conference, we have so much to give. And so Sam and I decided to do a webinar for parents. So on April 8th, Wednesday, April 8th at 10:30 in the morning, we're going to do an hour-long webinar for parents, just on managing anxiety and boosting family resilience. I think the title is Managing Anxiety and Boosting Family Resilience in Uncertain Times.
So that's 10:30 a.m.
10:30 a.m. Yeah, West Coast.
Pacific time.
Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly.
Okay.
So that's the first thing. We're still in the brainstorming phase. We want to do more because we know the need is skyrocketing.
Okay. And I'll have a link for that up at the show notes page. But do you have a URL you can tell people?
Just go to our Facebook page. Go into Facebook and enter Family First Psychotherapy. You'll see the house, our greenhouse logo.
Okay.
And I think the video and link to the registration page is on there. It's pinned to the top.
Awesome. All right, brother. Mica, thank you, man. You are awesome. I mean, you have this really awesome way of articulating a lot of concepts that I know a lot of the listeners here are like, oh my gosh, this is awesome. There's a lot of gold nuggets. Love it.
Good. I'm happy to help however I can. I appreciate that.
All right. Stay healthy, man. We'll be in touch.
All right. Take care, brother.
All right. Bye-bye.